The first voyage around the world, 5 Spanish ships. They sailed to the edge of the world, chasing fortune, glory, and immortality. But what awaited them was hunger, storms, and death. They ate leather belts and rats just to stay alive. We've seen lands that no map ever showed, but every mile was paid for with lives. They fought enemies no one could ever defeat. This isn't a story of heroes. It's a story of greed, betrayal, and sacrifice. What was the price we had to pay for all we endured to see the world the way it really is? Behind it all stood just one man, a former soldier who'd been thrown out of service, a man who had lost everything he ever had.
Ferdinand Magellan.
Somewhere around 1515 or 1516, a Portuguese subject named Fernão de Magalhães, that was his name at birth, came to King Manuel of Portugal for an audience. We know him as Ferdinand Magellan. That man came from an ancient, once noble but fallen family, a soldier who'd fought in the Indian and Moroccan wars. He came back from the last battle crippled, a spear had pierced his knee, and he already knew he'd limp for the rest of his life. That was the end of his military path. No one needed a crippled soldier anymore. He had risked his life countless times for Portugal, again and again. And what did he get in return? Miserable pay. No recognition, no honors at all. So he demanded a meeting with the king himself.
Let's take a breather, and I'll tell you how matters like this were handled in those days. A sort of handbook for dealing with kings. You had to worm your way into the confidence of several courtiers, win their support, look around carefully, and make arrangements so they'd prime the ruler and put in a good word for you. Then you had to find the right moment. Wait till he was in a good mood. And when you finally met, be careful, gentle, choose every word. And if you felt it wasn't going well, you had to back off, disappear, and wait for a better chance. 'Cause once a ruler starts saying no, he'll keep saying no. But Magellan didn't get those rules at all. He did everything. You absolutely shouldn't. Direct and honest. Here's how people described him.
This short, dark-skinned, quiet man, ordinary, unnoticeable, and without a trace of charm, had never been able to win anyone's sympathy. And for reasons no one could explain, the king had always disliked him. Magellan didn't know how to smile, to offer kind words, to charm or please, nor could he defend his views gracefully. He was untalkative, withdrawn, and shrouded in a mist of solitude.
So, King Manuel finally received him. Magellan asked to raise his pay by just half a cruzado because of his wounds. It was a ridiculous, almost laughable sum, yet he insisted. Because at court, a man's pay determined his rank on the noble ladder. And he, 35-year-old veteran of the Indian and Moroccan wars, earned the same as the boys opening the king's door. The king could have easily agreed. But he said no. And according to our guide on how to talk to kings, Magellan should have stepped back right away and waited for a better moment. But Magellan kept going. Is there truly no place in the royal service duty worthy of my hands?
Ships sailed from Portugal almost every week, so giving Magellan a command made sense. He had rounded the Cape of Good Hope 4 times, risked his life many times, and been wounded 3. But King Manuel, already furious, told him no. That insult became his turning point. Here's what's interesting. Magellan had offered the royal court a plan for a sea expedition. Maybe he didn't even get to explain it fully, but the fact remains the project was rejected, and he was told to seek his fortune elsewhere. Just like King Juan II once turned down Christopher Columbus, and Columbus went to Spain, Portugal's rival, and discovered America, though of course he was looking for India, but that's another story, full of its own twists and surprises. Now Manuel turned away from Magellan. The former soldier didn't leave right away. He stayed in Portugal for another year. People saw him in taverns with sailors who had sailed the southern seas. He also visited the king's secret archives, studying maps made by explorers.
At that time, the maps were top secret. A royal decree forbade sharing any data about Portugal's discoveries under pain of death. Magellan read all logs from the Brazilian expeditions. So what was that project that fascinated Magellan so much? Here's what he had in mind.
He wanted to sail westward to reach the richest spice islands, what we now know as the Maluku Islands. Back then, spices were worth more than gold. In Europe, their price could rise 200 times once resold.
You remember, Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India, and after that, Portugal slowly began to establish its own trading posts there. I've already told you about that in an earlier episode.
The Europeans took control of ports along East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Ceylon and Burma.
Their ships would sail into those ports, take on goods and slaves, and carry everything back home. The main rival of Portugal at that time was Spain, and now comes an important moment. Look at the map.
In 1494, the Pope of Rome divided the entire world between those two great naval powers. He drew an imaginary line across the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere near the Cape Verde and Azores Islands. Everything to the west of that line went to Spain, and everything to the east, to Portugal. That meant the Spaniards had their bases on the American continent, while for the Portuguese it was India and Malacca. The Spice Islands were in the east, on Portugal's side, and they were hauling in piles of money from there. But Magellan believed those islands were actually closer to America, and he wanted to sail not east around Africa, as the Portuguese did along Vasco da Gama's route, but west, circling around the Americas.
By that time, people already understood that Earth was a sphere, that if you went west, you could reach the east. The problem was no one could find that way. Spain had sent several expeditions, but none could make it around America. They tried to find a way through, but kept failing again and again. No matter how they turned, they always ended up hitting land. So Magellan's idea really wasn't unique. What was surprising was that he claimed to know exactly where the strait between the oceans was.
But where did he get that information? In the Portuguese royal archives, Magellan discovered a map made by the king's own cartographer, along with a note saying that one Portuguese ship, somewhere near the 40th degree south latitude, had found and rounded a cape much like the Cape of Good Hope. And beyond that cape, there was said to be a wide strait, resembling Gibraltar. And nothing would be easier than to reach the Maluku Islands, the Spice Islands, by sailing through it.
Neither he nor the cartographer knew. It was a huge mistake. There was no such strait there.
But Magellan's certainty kept driving him forward. He simply couldn't stop anymore. Since Portugal had turned its back on him, he decided to go to the Spanish court.
Magellan was standing before a serious choice. He wasn't leaving, like Columbus. He was preparing to hand over secret information about Portugal's sea routes. He understood that this would make him an enemy of his homeland. And the Portuguese nobleman, former captain of the royal fleet, chose treason.
In 1517, he arrived in Spain, an emigrant, a defector, unknown to anyone. He needed to make the right connections. Soon, he met Diego Barbosa, a knight of the Order of Santiago who had sailed the Indian Seas. Diego's son was a sailor too, and a friendship formed. Before long, Diego's daughter fell in love with the 37-year-old Magellan, and they married. Everything seemed to fall into place. Magellan finally had a proper place in society. He went to the Casa de Contratación, the Indian chamber managing Spain's overseas trade. Sailors and sponsors proposed new expeditions, but the chamber rejected him. 3 board members laughed at his plan and threw him out. Magellan was in complete despair, but then a note was unexpectedly delivered to him. One of the board members wanted to meet in person. His name was Juan de Aranda. He said he'd finance the expedition himself. As a government man, he had refused it, but as a private one, he agreed without hesitation. Of course, he wasn't interested in exploration or great discoveries. He simply understood that if the venture succeeded, there would be a lot of money to gain. Magellan didn't care who funded him. The deal was made. Juan de Aranda used all his valuable connections to make the expedition finally happen. They got an audience with the king and his royal council. There, Magellan at last confidently presented his ambitious idea. "We'll sail west, find the islands, prove they lie in the western Spanish hemisphere. I know exactly how to reach them." And the king agreed. In 1 month, Magellan achieved what he had been unable to accomplish in 10 long years of service in Portugal.
Charles signed a formal agreement with Magellan and the cartographer, Rui Faleiro. They were promised 1/20th of all profits from all new lands that they would discover. If they found more than 6 islands, they could claim 2 as their own. Both they and their heirs were granted the title of governors of all new lands and islands.
The king equipped them with 5 ships and promised everything they needed for 2 years: crews, food, and artillery. He even issued a royal decree stating that all classes, from courtiers to soldiers, must give full support in every matter. Indeed, the monarch personally supervised every stage of the preparations. Whenever problems arose, and there were many, he stepped in, commanded them to be fixed immediately, and forbade any delay. Honestly, that's every sailor's dream. And so, the Portuguese Ferdinand Magellan became, in Spain, Fernando Magellan, Admiral, Knight of the Order of Santiago, and governor of all lands and islands yet to be discovered. Preparations began in Seville.
Unlike Columbus, Magellan handled the outfitting of the expedition himself. And you understand, that alone was a colossal task. How much food would they need? How long would they sail? A year? 2? Maybe 3? What's the climate there? And if there's a fight, how much weapon do they bring? Just imagine trying to plan all that when you sail to the unknown.
He oversaw every single item loaded onto his ships, every sack, every rope. He stocked an enormous amount of weapons and supplies, including good wine, enough for each crew member to have 2 cups a day for 2 years. Spoiler: as always, the wine ran out early. They brought cows aboard, first for milk, then for fresh meat. For trading, they packed cloth, women's dresses, mirrors, and so on. We actually know the price of almost every single thing because Magellan kept a detailed ship inventory. His bookkeeping was strict and precise. King Manuel of Portugal couldn't stay calm upon hearing about Magellan's growing preparations and unexpected success in Spain. He couldn't believe his ears. The soldier he had once rejected in disgrace was now assembling a proud fleet under another nation's flag. Manuel sent his ambassador to spy on the preparations and try to delay the voyage. The ambassador met with Ferdinand, attempting to persuade him to change his mind and return to Portugal, though death surely awaited him there. He even appealed to King Charles, asking that the Portuguese be sent back or that the expedition be postponed for a year. Yeah, right, just enough time for Portugal to get ahead of them. He did everything he could, but the 18-year-old King Charles I of Spain, though young, understood perfectly well what was going on. He refused to change a thing.
Did he trust Magellan? Only partly. Of the 5 ships, Magellan commanded 1, his companion another, and the remaining 3 were under strict Spanish command. The king permitted only a small number of Portuguese sailors on board, just enough to assist, but still far outnumbered by the Spaniards. Rumors began to spread everywhere, started by the spies of the Portuguese crown, claiming that the admiral would sail beneath the Spanish flag, yet secretly act for Portugal's benefit. Traitor. Of course, that affected the crew's attitude toward him. Magellan, meanwhile, feared that the king might have secretly granted the Spanish captain special authority and seized control of the fleet.
Still, he had friends among them: Duarte Barbosa, his brother-in-law, João Serrao, brother of Magellan's close friend, and an Italian nobleman, Antonio Pigafetta, who joined the voyage almost by accident at the last minute, became the chronicler of this great adventure. Thanks to him, we know the voyage in detail.
You shouldn't believe everything Pigafetta wrote. Sometimes the sailors fooled that young man, but still, he described their journey with remarkable passion and awe. To be honest, there were only 5 to 10 men Magellan could truly rely on. How's that for a crew setting off to the very end of the world?
On August 10th, 1519, without accurate maps, without a united crew, with spies hidden on board, and on old, though carefully repaired, ships under Magellan's command, who for the first time was leading an entire squadron, the brave fleet finally set out on its journey. The flagship was the Trinidad, followed by the San Antonio, the smallest one, Victoria, Concepcion, and Santiago. Only Magellan himself knew exactly where they were heading. The admiral trusted no one with his plan. Through incredible storms and tempests, for 4 long and grueling months, they struggled toward the shores of South America, and finally, they reached the edge of their known world.
At last, they saw the coastline turning. It matched Magellan's expectations, the strait they'd been searching for, the passage to the South Sea.
But after 2 weeks of sailing, it became clear it wasn't a strait at all. It was a massive bay, stretching 300 kilometers inland and 200 wide, the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, the place from the Portuguese archives.
It turned out that the secret data he relied on, the same information he had kept hidden and used to convince the king that he knew where the passage lay, was wrong. When Magellan realized that, he was shaken, terrified, crushed. The admiral had promised the king a passage, convinced everyone the expedition was worth it, promised his ruler untold riches, and bravely led 265 men, only to find himself at a dead end. But he couldn't give up, and above all, he couldn't let anyone see that this was the very spot he'd believed was the strait. The admiral gave the order, and the fleet continued south, along the coast. Magellan hoped the passage lay farther on. Months went by, there was still no success. They explored every bay, hoping that a passage to the South Sea, as they called the Pacific back then, would open. The bright sun vanished, replaced by gray clouds. No tropical forests, only penguins and seals.
On one of the ships, a mutiny broke out. The captain refused to obey the admiral's orders. The stern Magellan had him captured and thrown straight into the brig. He thought he'd crushed a minor uprising, but that was only what it seemed. Meanwhile, outside, the cold was brutal. It was time to stop for the winter. They anchored in the San Julian Bay, not the worst place. There was fresh water and plenty of fish. Magellan ordered the anchors dropped. The crew looked around, confused. Before them stretched a bleak, desolate land.
Most of the sailors had long grown dissatisfied with Magellan. Knowing this, he took an important and risky step for his own position. He decided to reduce food rations, so the supplies would last much longer. On the island, they encountered the natives. The Europeans named the people Patagonians, and the land Patagonia.
At first, their relations were friendly, almost trusting, but the Patagonians didn't know Magellan's order to bring back to his homeland specimens of plants, minerals, and every unknown human race. After showering a few of the visitors with gifts, enough to keep their hands full, the Europeans showed them iron shackles. The natives thought they were bracelets and let the sailors put them on. By the time they realized they were chained, it was too late. They were taken aboard the ships. You can imagine what happened next. After witnessing the kidnapping, the rest of the tribe never approached again, and those captured never made it to Europe. They died along the way.
In Patagonia, another grim episode took place. On the night of April 2nd, 1520, 8 months after they'd set sail from Spain, something that had been building for a long time finally erupted. A mutiny. Only one ship stayed loyal to the admiral, the Santiago, commanded by Magellan's old friend Juan Serrao. The mutineers' demand was simple: return to Spain. To Spain! The admiral couldn't possibly let that happen.
The sailors loyal to Magellan helped him crush the mutiny. One rebel got a knife to the throat, the rest were chained. The main conspirator, Gaspar Quesada, a former Royal Navy captain, was executed and quartered. The instigators, Cartagena and a priest, were left behind, alone in Patagonia. By the way, Juan Sebastian Elcano was pardoned. Remember that navigator. He'll play a huge role later in this story.
It was time to move forward. Once the storms had finally calmed, Magellan sent out the Santiago, the swiftest of all his ships, on reconnaissance. But during a storm, it was thrown onto the rocks and smashed to pieces. Luckily, almost the entire crew survived.
Only on August 25th, 1520, did they finally leave that lonely bay. The admiral was deeply frustrated. So much time wasted, one ship lost, and still no trace of the strait. His spirits sank. The next day, he ordered the fleet to drift idly for 2 months. He didn't know that the passage he'd been searching for was just 2 days away. Only 2 days, after more than 300 behind them. He was right there at the goal, but the ships needed repair. So it wasn't until October 18th that the fleet weighed anchor again. On the 3rd day of sailing, they reached a cape. Before them stretched a bleak and hostile landscape, steep cliffs, icy waters, and snow-covered mountain peaks. It was impossible to believe that by sailing through this terrifying maze, they'd reach the hot, fragrant Spice Islands. It looked more like a frozen road to hell, a passage straight into Mordor.
Everyone tried to talk Magellan out of going in, but he felt he couldn't take the risk of passing this bay by. What if this was the one, though the risk was enormous? In that narrow passage, the ships could crash against the rocks, a disaster he'd lose both men and vessels.
Even so, the 4 ships, for the first time in history, entered that labyrinth. The fleet sailed through a twisting, narrow, dangerous channel. They saw no people, but fires were visible along the shores, meaning people probably lived there, just refusing to show themselves. The admiral named this land the Land of Fire, Tierra del Fuego.
The route was unbelievably dangerous, bends, turns, shallows everywhere. But Magellan advanced very slowly and carefully, studying each curve in detail and marking everything on his map. This treacherous place would haunt sailors for decades, a confusing maze of constantly shifting winds and unpredictable waters. Only after 38 long, exhausting days did they finally reach the open sea.
It was the strait. It was real. The passage to the South Sea, as they called the Pacific back then, had been found. Today, we know it as the Strait of Magellan. That discovery earned the admiral immortality. The strait stretches 570 kilometers long.
Before them stood a serious problem. The provisions would last only 3 months. What should they do now? Turn back or keep moving forward. The admiral chose to continue, to sail straight into the unknown, and that single decision would cost the lives of most of his crew. But the farther west they went, the gentler the weather grew, warmer and calmer. The sheer cliffs disappeared, giving way to open meadows, green fields, trees, and fruit.
But then, suddenly, at some moment, the San Antonio disappeared into the fog. Magellan searched for it for several days before he understood the truth. The ship hadn't gone down. Their biggest and finest vessel, the one carrying most of the remaining supplies, had deserted and turned back. What could he do? There was only one choice: to keep going, hoping to find the Spice Islands soon. On November 28th, 1520, the 3 remaining ships entered the South Sea. The weather was perfect, the ocean calm, and Magellan named it Pacific, and that's the name it carries to this very day.
3 ships bravely sailed across that vast, endless ocean, just hoping that luck would be on their side.
By their calculations, the Spice Islands were just 3 days away, but at that time, no one knew the true size of the Earth, so they couldn't imagine what lay ahead. A week went by, then a month, then another. Hunger struck. Many sailors grew sick with scurvy and died. The drinking water turned foul, the wine was gone long ago, and the rats had eaten the last of the food. Soon, those rats themselves became the finest delicacy on board. Antonio Pigafetta wrote, "To keep ourselves from starving to death, we ate pieces of leather that once covered the great yard. After more than a year of rain and harsh winds, the leather had become so hard that we had to soak it in seawater for 4 or 5 days before we could even chew it. Only then did we roast it slightly, and that was what we ate to survive."
After 4 long months of searching, in March 1521, Magellan finally discovered the islands. The natives ran out to meet them, and it turned out to be salvation for the starving, exhausted crew. The islanders happily traded fish, chickens, milk, and coconuts for small Spanish trinkets. They fed the sailors well, and for the first time in many months, the crew regained their strength and got some rest. Then they set out to explore more islands. That's how Magellan claimed new lands for Spain, and under his agreement with the king, he became the official ruler of one of them. Today, we know that territory as the Philippine Islands. Their next stop was the island of Masawa.
However, Magellan decided to send his slave Enrique ahead first. And imagine everyone's shock when they discovered that Enrique understood the natives' language. He hadn't understood a word spoken by any of the earlier islanders. He'd been sold into slavery and brought to Europe from Malacca. And now, after nearly circling the entire world, this man, a slave, had returned home.
Everything became clear and fully proven. The Earth was round. Magellan had found the route once sought by Columbus and other explorers. Days remained before reaching the Maluku Islands, the legendary Spice Islands with unimaginable wealth and treasures were about to open before them.
The islanders were amazed by the strange European things: shining knives, armor that made a man invincible, fine clothes. They were also fascinated by the Europeans' religious rituals.
When a mass was held on Easter, the islanders watched the entire ceremony with great curiosity. Seeing their keen interest, Magellan asked if they wanted to embrace Christianity, and the natives joyfully agreed. Of course, they didn't realize that by doing so, they were placing themselves under the rule of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church, but the crew knew it well. Magellan couldn't leave any official Spanish presence there, so he decided at least to start converting the people on the neighboring islands. And soon, they set sail for the largest of them all, the island of Cebu.
There it was much busier. More boats, more junks, more people everywhere. Trade quickly picked up. For 14 pounds of iron, the islanders would bring 15 pounds of pure gold.
Magellan wasn't as bloodthirsty as, say, Vasco da Gama. Watch if you missed our episode about him. Because Vasco da Gama was like a madman, slaughtering people with terrifying cruelty. Magellan didn't start firing cannons or killing innocents to spread fear. Always he tried to negotiate. And that's what truly set him apart from many other conquerors of his time.
On a small island called Mactan, the local ruler opposed the Spaniards and their new faith. His name was Lapu-Lapu. Magellan sent his slave Enrique with a message. The ruler must recognize the king of Cebu's authority and accept Spain's protection, or face the consequences.
Both the Raja of Cebu and Magellan's captains warned him not to go, but he insisted. Everything had gone peacefully before. Why not now? He thought he could handle one chief. But that ruler refused peace and threatened them with weapons. Magellan took only 60 men with him, though he could have brought more, and went ashore. All the admiral wanted was to show how strong and powerful they were, that there was no need to fight. They meant no harm.
On April 26, 1521, the Europeans rowed toward the island in their boats, but the coral reefs put them in great danger. They couldn't land. The armed party had to jump into the water and wade forward, the sea rising up to their thighs. On the shore, about 1,500 warriors were waiting, as Pigafetta wrote, and they rushed forward with wild fury. For half an hour, the European musketeers and crossbowmen fired from their boats, but the range was too long. The armor offered no protection, since the islanders aimed straight for their legs, the only parts left bare. The Europeans were pelted with spears, darts, and stones.
A poisoned arrow struck Magellan in the leg. His men began to retreat, and he, with about 8 others, stayed to cover them. His helmet was knocked off, a spear hit his face, another his arm, it went numb. His leg was slashed, and when he fell, the islanders rushed him and struck him again and again until he stopped moving. The crew couldn't believe what they had seen.
For no amount of money would the islander Lapu-Lapu agree to give up the admiral's body. No one knows what they did with his remains, or what fate befell them. No one knows where he was buried, or if he was ever buried at all.
The man who had accomplished one of the greatest feats of the Age of Discovery, who found the strait and conquered the vast Pacific Ocean, died on a small, lonely island at the hands of those he once hoped to make peace with.
After his death, the aura of invincibility surrounding the Europeans disappeared. Magellan's slave Enrique betrayed them. Some Spaniards were lured to a feast and slaughtered, including several captains.
The remaining ships fled at once, leaving behind those they couldn't rescue. Out of the 265 men, only 115 remained. That wasn't enough to command 3 ships, and they made the decision to burn the Concepcion.
But they still needed the Spice Islands, and soon they found them. The local king welcomed them kindly, for there had lived and recently died Francisco Serrano, Magellan's friend and the brother of the captain killed in the Philippines. See the connection? The crew bought precious spices and magnificent birds of paradise. They traded muskets, cloaks, leather belts, making quite a profit. But when everything was ready for departure, the Trinidad began to leak badly. So the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, the very same man from earlier, the one who'd been pardoned after the mutiny, set sail for home.
The Trinidad stayed behind for repairs. Later, she tried to return home, but after 6 months across the Pacific, came back to the Maluku Islands. Most of the crew had perished. The survivors were captured by the Portuguese. Almost all of them died in prisons or on plantations.
The Victoria set sail on December 21st, 1521, survived a terrible, nearly endless storm near the Cape of Good Hope. Then, on September 6th, 1522, after 9 exhausting months at sea, the brave Victoria finally entered a Spanish harbor.
On board were only 18 sailors, exhausted by hunger and disease, dressed in torn, tattered clothes. The first voyage around the world was finally complete. Now you understand that the navigator never completed the world voyage himself. It was his crew who did, and without him, they likely wouldn't have succeeded. How were they welcomed back? You know, in the 3 years since their voyage began, a lot had changed in Spain. Mexico had been discovered and conquered, a new safe source of wealth, and Spain was now fighting for dominance in Europe. No one cared about the crew's great discovery.
Yet through Magellan and Elcano's expedition, humanity proved it was possible to sail around the globe. They realized water covered most of Earth's surface, discovered the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and reached the southern edge of South America.
The sale of spices from the Victoria covered all the costs and brought profit.
Elcano and Magellan proved that the Maluku Islands lay within Spanish domains. Later, the Portuguese bought them from Spain for 350,000 gold ducats, roughly $73.5 million today. For 4 centuries, the Strait of Magellan remained the main passage into the Pacific, until 1914, when the Panama Canal opened. In the 1990s, a full-scale replica of the Victoria sailed around the world, retracing the admiral's legendary route.